Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton. Charles Dickens was not a fan of the Industrial Revolution. In A Walk in a Workhouse, written in 1850, he described the congregation as follows: mumbling, bleary-eyed, spectacled, stupid, deaf, lame, vacantly winking in the gleams of sun that now and then crept in through the open doors from the paved yard, shading their listening ears or blinking eyes with their withered hands, poring over their books, leering at nothing, going to sleep, crouching and drooping in corners. There were weird old women, all skeleton within, all bonnet and cloak without, continually wiping their eyes with dirty dusters of pocket handkerchiefs. And there were ugly old crones, both male and female, with a ghastly kind of contentment upon them which was not at all comforting to see. On that tour, he visits a room, a purgatory of sorts, according to him, with 8 lunatic women ranting to one another under the supervision of one sane resident, and in their midst, a rather unfortunate 20-something who was perfectly sane but suffered from epileptic fits, so had been imprisoned there in the room full of lunatics, where she bitterly complained about how difficult it was to sleep amidst the ranting. Dickens said of her, "If this girl had stolen her mistress's watch, I do not hesitate to say she would, in all probability, have been infinitely better off. We've come to this absurd, this dangerous, this monstrous pass that the dishonest felon is, in respect of cleanliness, order, diet, and accommodation, better provided for and taken care of than the honest pauper." In other words, there in Victorian England, it was better to be in prison than in poverty. Dickens is kind of the poet laureate of cruelty and poverty in this era, and he came by it honestly. His father had been in some financial trouble and got sent to debtor's prison when he was a kid, so young Charles Dickens and his mother moved into a poor neighborhood of London where he spent his boyhood working in a shoeblacking factory, a transition which was deeply traumatic, going from lower middle class but aspiring lifestyle in peaceful Kent to suddenly being upended and working in a factory as a child in squalid, sooty, coughing London. And in that regard, Dickens lived personally that which society in general tends to understand the Industrial Revolution as a happy, bucolic existence in a clean, garden-filled rural shires suddenly collapsed before the unquenchable maw of industrial capitalism. And the horrified, displaced denizens of those shires herded like cattle into the cities to work as all but slave labor in cacophonous workshops. Except that Dickens' experience was actually very different than most of the people working in those factories alongside him, that of poor rural England. He'd been born into a lower middle class, literate family. His father had been a clerk. Going from that to urban penury had indeed been a horrible experience. And you can totally understand why he would assume everybody else in the factories had experienced comparable crises, horrible falls from grace. But going from middle class to factory worker was very different than going from the rural working poor to factory worker. The rural working poor who flooded the cities to work in factories were escaping lives that were even more bleak than the horrors described by Charles Dickens. These stooped people with bent and broken backs, toiling for hours at subsistence agriculture, were half-starved and painfully poor, with erratic incomes and fraught diets. They were basically serfs, and they lived in total abject poverty. For example, take the word threshold, as in crossing the threshold of a house. In this era, and before, a standard home in rural England, little more than a shed, had clay or dirt floors, which, if you know England, are apt to be perpetually cold and damp. So peasants would pour thresh, like mulch, basically mulch. They'd pour that over the raw clay to insulate themselves from the bitter earth. And they would run a little bar across the floor of their front door to keep that mulch, that thresh, from going out. That was the threshold. That's where the term comes from. And that thresh was putrefying. Erasmus visited such houses in his travels, and he talked about how the thresh was rarely, if ever, replaced. The peasants had not the time or the money or the energy to do so, so thresh would gradually accumulate old beer, fish heads, and vomit. When it rained and water soaked in from the clay floors through the thresh, pungent odors would uncoil from it and gag the inhabitants, who slept underneath thatched roofs, which you'll be forgiven for thinking are quaint, charming. But real thatch roofs are horrible. They are constantly rotting. Rats and mice live in them. Their droppings fall on you from the ceiling. They get in your clothing, in your bed. And when thatch isn't rotting, it's probably catching fire. The peasants, who were mostly illiterate and often starving, slept on a single communal mattress in a pile in the middle of the floor of a single room, along with all of the vermin that lived there and probably a lot of livestock. But from a distance, thatched houses are indeed very cute and charming looking. They look quaint, which is how, until the Industrial Revolution, the landed gentry and the then fractional middle class understood the rural poor from a distance. It wasn't that the Industrial Revolution invented poverty. By the vast majority of metrics, it alleviated poverty. It was that the Industrial Revolution made poverty front and center in a way which the well-to-do had never really been confronted with previously. It's a bit like, okay, imagine when I say Appalachia, you picture in your mind the Andy Griffith Show. Just nice, simple farm folk living peaceful, wholesome lives, not particularly complex or sophisticated, just salt of the earth, simple people, ma and pop stores, fishing holes, organized religion, aw shucks, Sadie Hawkins dances and whatnot. You're thinking,
The Andy Griffith Show, starring Andy Griffith.
but you're not used to being in that environment. You're seeing a projected version of it. The reality is, in this particular town, fentanyl. The reality is the Rust Belt, diabetes, and unemployment. Then, an Amazon warehouse opens up in your city, and Appalachians from that particular town start pouring in search of higher wages. I think the starting wages at Amazon are like $15 an hour and air conditioned. And you think, when you find out about the conditions of the factory, this is horrible. Excuse me, the warehouse. This is horrible. They work such long hours, they're surveilled, they're harshly disciplined, and there's this relentless quota compelling Amazon workers to hit numbers that are so insane that some of them just pee in bottles instead of taking bathroom breaks. It is horrible how Amazon has immiserated these people from the bucolic lives they enjoyed on the Andy Griffith Show. You can understand how, suddenly confronted with real and horrible poverty in a very uncomfortable daily up-close manner, that people writing about it at the time were aware of poverty in a way they'd never previously noticed. And we, looking back and reading their stuff, are struck by that poverty as something new and fresh and aberrant and horrible. And as a result, we're aware of inequality in a way that never really occurred to folks previously. And you might think that the economic conflict of that era was between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, the Scrooges and the Cratchits. However, that is decidedly not how the haves viewed that period. Rich people in the Victorian era did not see themselves as a united front of plutocrats trying to hold the proletariat down. They saw themselves fighting out an economic civil war of the affluent. On one side was the old landed gentry, the last remnants of the ancient feudal order, men who had inherited their wealth and whose wealth consisted in land and farming. They nominally believed in noblesse oblige, but very much believed in knowing your place and role in life. On the other side of the economic conflict were the urban nouveau rich, factory owners, industrialists, and entrepreneurs who were upending that old feudal manorial system. The landed gentry hated those guys. Historically, for most of history, elites tend to look down on anybody whose job involves working with money. Nobles are above that. They just are. They spend their time hunting and socializing and running for parliament. People who scheme about profits and spreadsheets and commerce, these are crass, sleazy, pushy people, a bit like how we now view the paparazzi. For most of history, the feeling you have about the paparazzi is how most people viewed merchants, bankers, moneylenders, anybody that worked with lucre. In 1846, liberals and the nouveau rich, these folks that the landed gentry hated, succeeded in repealing the Corn Laws in England, which were tariffs on imported food that kept food prices in England artificially high, and by doing so kept those old feudal estates competitive and profitable. Absent the Corn Laws, the landed gentry had now to compete with other countries and lost significant amounts of their income. Worse, the tenant farmers and crofters who had toiled on their lands for generations were now packing up and moving to the cities to work in factories. The labor was defecting to those sleazy industrialists. So not surprisingly, the old landed gentry loved writers like Charles Dickens, who pointed out the evils of this new hellish economy, these evil factory owners, the filth and inhumanity of cities. Or William Blake, who referred to factories as dark satanic mills, or William Wordsworth, or books like Tess of the D'Urbervilles, fretting over the disappearing bucolic rural life to modernity. Wasn't it all better back in the old days, when everybody lived on happy little farms with their cute thatched roofs, playing the fiddle, breathing fresh air? Wasn't that nice? Don't you miss the Andy Griffith Show? Don't you hate what Amazon warehouse has reduced you to? Shouldn't we bring back the Corn Laws? Now, to be clear, there were all sorts of horrible, depraved, miserable things going on during the Industrial Revolution. I don't mean to indicate that I would want to live during this period or that it was a bed of roses for anybody involved. But when you look at things like wages, calories, access to education and medicine, life expectancy and mobility, the Industrial Revolution, and all those people working in those horrible circumstances were experiencing an upgrade, not a descent. The idea that the Industrial Revolution impoverished the masses, rather than the reality of heralding their liberation, is just one of several economic myths we will discuss today, right here on The Political Orphanage. My guests today are Phil Gramm. He is a former senator from the great state of Texas, and Don Boudreaux, who is an economist at George Mason University. They are the authors of The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism. You can find that book, as well as all books that we discuss in this program, by going to mightyheaton.com/featured. Hello, Dr. Boudreaux and Senator Gramm.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, so you're tackling 7 economic myths, and before we get into them, I'm curious as to why you think they exist. Because we're not really debating whether or not gravity exists. Everybody's pretty on board with that. We're not even really debating like how big a door should be. Doors are usually like, 30 by 80 inches. But we're still debating who screwed up on the Great Recession and even to some extent the Great Depression. Why do those things persist?
I think they persist because people hold a set of values based on their view of how the world works and their historical experience and their reading of history. And so Thomas Jefferson said, good men with the same facts are prone to disagree. But we have found that when you find profound disagreement, like what do people think the role of government in a free society is, that if you probe deeper, you find that those same people have very different views of the Industrial Revolution, the progressive era regulatory system and its success or failure, what caused the Great Depression? Was it the failure of capitalism or the failure of government? Was manufacturing in America hollowed out by trade? Did deregulation cause a financial crisis? And what do they think about causes of poverty and inequality in America? And so we have focused in on those areas that, for the vast majority of Americans, basically are the basis on which the lens they see the world through is ground. What they think about caused or generated the history of that period. And so what we set about is to try to go back and first the undisputed facts, and then what we think the myth is, and then we are giving it a full airing and all the data and all the documentation and all the credible people that made the argument. And then we set about on a factual basis and logical basis, trying to debunk the myth. And obviously it's up to the reader as to their good judgment as to how well we did.
Yeah, can I add something to complement that? Among the other things we did is to look at some of the textbooks that are used in high school and college, the popular textbooks, not fringe ones. And what you find in these textbooks are repetitions, by and large, of these fallacies, that the Great Depression was caused by a failure of capitalism. The 1920s was a speculative excess caused by growing inequality and the rich stomping on the poor, that the Industrial Revolution in England and later in the United States was built on the back of poor workers. And we quote in the book several long passages from popular textbooks that sell in the millions today.
Bestsellers.
Yeah, and so the formal educational establishment, K through 12 schooling in the U. Oh, we don't look at K, but
that's a really good K if they're going over the Great Depression. In that K.
Public schooling, probably not about general schooling in the United States at the collegiate and at the secondary level, continues to spread these fallacies as if they are unchallenged, indisputable facts. Now, people can dispute them, and we do dispute them. But the way these facts are treated in these textbooks, it's as if it's the law of gravity. Well, no reasonable person could possibly think otherwise. And so we have quotations to show that we're not slaying straw men.
Yeah, in reading your book, it made me go back to my own schooling in Deer Creek Public Schools, which I had a good experience at, incidentally, and I had very good teachers. But I thought about that and my university experience, and there was a bedrock premise that didn't even really need to be explained, which was, look, capitalism's good. We're not communists, but capitalism is inherently erratic and predatory. And so the story of history is we stumbled onto capitalism, but it was really raw and had rough edges, and we've gradually tamed it through the state and the regulatory process. And whenever you pull that back, it results in it going loose again and becoming wild.
Yeah, and that's still a dominant theme. Yeah,
it's totally accurate. And the truth is, the 7 myths that we said about debunking are conventional wisdom today in high schools and colleges all over the world.
What I was instructed with when I was in high school was industrial magnates like Carnegie and Vanderbilt and the like became incredibly powerful. They created things called trusts. I don't know what one is, but I know they're bad. And these trusts dominated the economy, could order the government around, and suppressed workers' wages. And fortunately, Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives came in and busted the trusts, and the monopolies were destroyed, and we were able to regain affluence and workers' rights and such. What is wrong with this?
That's pretty much the story people still get in school.
Yeah, it's the same story they get, and every element of it is untrue.
Yeah.
It is true.
They did get rich. But the
rich got rich, but the poor got rich too.
Yeah.
And the poor got richer faster because they had a lower starting base. No, what happened is we'd never had nationwide markets. All economics had been local. And so when these new movements came with the railroads and with the spread of electricity and
Telegraph and telephone.
and if you go to Pennsylvania, you go out in the country and you see all these iron smelters that were built, and then they cut all the lumber around it. And then when they had burned up all the lumber, they moved to another area. And within a very short period of time, we went from that to Pittsburgh and the factories, and the cost of these items plummeted. And as the cost plummeted, real wages rose. And to some degree, historians and observers at the time were confused because from the end of the Civil War until about 1900, prices fell in America at almost 1.5% a year because production outran the growth of money supply. Exactly the opposite of the modern era. And so it is true that there were big companies, but there's almost no evidence where they successfully colluded, and limited supply. Prices fell throughout the period. And interestingly enough, if you look at the data, prices fell more before the Sherman Act, the 20 years before, than they fell after the Sherman Act. And of course, you'll remember that the net result of all this regulation was that under the leadership of Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy, we repealed all this progressive era regulation because it was basically preventing efficiency and benefiting the producer at the expense of the consumer. And when we overturned that regulation, things started to change. And we found our footing in the mid-70s with deregulation because we were losing our monopoly in manufacturing. But that opened up the explosion of transportation, communications, and the modern world we enjoy today. Carter gets very little credit for that.
And he deregulated airlines and craft beer. If you like craft beer, that's Jimmy Carter. That you should tip your glass to.
Cost of airline travel fell in half. The cost of moving things as a percentage of the GDP fell in half.
The trucking deregulation.
Right. Yeah, those were incredible positive steps.
Yeah, occasionally I'll have friends that'll lust after traveling on planes back in the 1950s, and they're like, gosh, it looked so much more sophisticated. People would wear, they had leg room, and they wore suits, and I'm like, right, because everyone was first class. That's it. There was no coach. You and I would not be flying. Maybe we do it once per lifetime. It's that everybody you now see in first class, that was the whole plan.
But we wouldn't.
Well,
okay, if I'm following you empirically here, during this era of the robber barons, prices go down, wages go up. So the empirical data, there's probably some exceptions, but by and large here, the
very few. Okay, very few.
So we could find one or two things to quibble about, but if we're looking at like overall just medians in terms of price and wages, they're favorable rather than disfavorable. This is still an era though where you could like hire guys to bust up a union. You could be arrested if you're in a union. This is before the Wagner Act, right? So there's still an element of like industrial titans being able to push people around. Yeah.
Well, it depends on what you call push around. You got to remember that our view of unions today is very much colored by what laws passed in the 1930s. That the ability of people to go and stop you from bringing in supplies to run your plant in 1880 was viewed as a clear violation of the law. So our basic concept of the rights of labor have changed pretty dramatically. Now, you had the right to not work for me. You had the right to quit. You had the right to say, I'm not being paid enough and leave. But you didn't have the right to prevent other people from working for me or for my plant to run. So it's not the way we view labor law today colors our view of what happened then, but that wasn't the law then. But
And
no,
and
yeah, go ahead.
I wouldn't defend every single act
No, me either.
of the business owners back in the 19th century who dealt with labor unions. But the way the story is told now, it's as if it's exclusively done by the owners against unions. Unions were very violent.
Exactly. Very violent.
If the firm wanted to, if other workers wanted to work at a plant whose other workers were on strike, the union would initiate violence against, they call them scab workers, of course. And then oftentimes these labor disputes were just the police and the companies trying to protect these scab workers, as they were called, against union violence. And then, of course, it oftentimes got out of control, and you had labor violence. Again, I'm not saying that every act by the business magnates was justified. I know that's not the case, but it's not exclusively a story of saintly unions against devilish entrepreneurs.
Yeah, and I also
there weren't any saints.
No.
Even though some of the really rich guys from this era that are supposed to just sort of be inherently evil, when I read about them, I'm like, I'm not seeing it. I'm sure there were those guys, but like, okay, Rockefeller never raises prices. I don't believe at any point Standard Oil ever raised prices. It just goes down, 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 down. So Rockefeller's getting rich by helping middle-class people like me be able to read at night, because that's what Standard Oil was. It was selling little kerosene deals.
And saving the whales.
Yeah, what he's doing is he constantly improved the process of producing and refining petroleum products, and the price declined dramatically. And as a result, he's accused of excluding competitors, but small companies had a hard time competing. But did the consumer benefit? Yes. And Standard Oil never had a monopoly. They never constrained production. They never raised price. And they always had competition. And the competition had a larger market share when Standard Oil was broken up than it did when the whole antitrust movement started. So, and again, it's two sides of the story. It's like the slaughter pens in Chicago, and the muckraking journalism, and the worker falling into the hamburger and being ground up, and you're eating him for lunch. Even the agency that was created by the law, which would have every incentive to want to expand their power and role, came in and said the whole Jungle Book, as it was called, the Jungle, that all of that was fallacy, that none of that happened. That it's true that that people had died at work, but nobody had died being ground up in hamburger.
Yeah. But Andrew, I don't think we cite this in our book, but in his wonderful biography of Rockefeller, Ron Chernow says something like, I started writing this, I'm paraphrasing, of course, started writing this book, and I had this view of Rockefeller. He was a really evil guy, but he's kind of a paradox. His workers loved him. He was a good man, but he did do some really questionable things. And then I read the whole biography, and the only questionable things is he kept running his prices down so low that his less efficient rivals couldn't compete with him.
What a jerk.
His only sin was competing.
Yeah, or
competing very well.
Or you look at like Andrew Carnegie. Like I went to Dunfermline, where he's from, a couple of years ago. I went to the Andrew Carnegie Museum, and he makes a ton of money. And then towards the end of his life, he's like, I was going to give it all away. So he just gives all of it away. He gives everything away. That's why we have Carnegie libraries across the country. And then he creates
No, that's right. Change the
a big
world.
prize for people that didn't murder anybody. Like at the end of his life, he's like, we really give a lot of medals to people that are good at killing people. Like in war, I want to have like an equivalent that's not killing people. And he hoped that would become, I was like, I don't know. I would like more rich people like that who drive down prices, make a fortune, and give it away.
You know, it's like rich people today. Am I worse off because Warren Buffett is rich? I'm better off because he's rich. Elon Musk sold me a satellite on my house that's a third cheaper than what I had and at least twice as good. So he's rich, but he made me richer.
Well, let's actually go back a moment, Senator. You brought up Upton Sinclair and meatpacking. I did not know anything about this, by the way, because the schooling I had was again capitalism having rough edges that had not yet been regulated, and so it was incredibly dangerous. And the ruthless search for profit was making people cut corners, hard rat droppings everywhere, and come to find out that a significant part of this is that there's these scale of economy slaughtering houses in Chicago. And so dudes where I'm from in Oklahoma are like, hey, you're making beef too cheap. Stop. We have to figure out how to make beef more expensive. And so they're,
And not only did they make beef cheaper, they made it a lot more sanitary. The real problems were the cow that was butchered in the back room and left there overnight. And they're the very people that are trying to impose restrictions on the stockyards. And granted, stockyards, it's not a beautiful process and it's hard work, but it dramatically lowered the cost of meat. It dramatically increased the quality and the safety. And they gave public tours of the places every day. So, I mean, it's a case of where there was a legislative action, but it was more driven by competitors.
That's right.
Than by any. It's like there was a major antitrust law passed to try to stop A&P from cutting grocery prices. Because they were the first nationwide grocery store, and they were driving local grocery stores out of business. And it was an outrage that people were getting this cheap food and they were not going to the old established grocery store. And that was serious. That was a serious issue, and the Congress legislated to protect the local grocery store against the consumer.
Yep.
Anybody that believes government is pro-consumer doesn't know government.
Yeah. This is an important thing to keep in mind. One of my great heroes is Gustavus Swift, who was one of the first meat packers in Chicago. And he was very instrumental in developing refrigeration as a means of preserving meat so that it could be slaughtered centrally and then dispersed throughout the country. Before Gustavus Swift and the rise of the Chicago meatpackers in the 1870s and 1880s, every town and hamlet had its own local butcher or several butchers. And this was very unsanitary. These animals were being slaughtered in the town. They had a part of the town that was devoted to the slaughtering, and the offal would be just dropped on the ground. There was some ways to deal with it, but one of the benefits of the centralization of slaughtering was it cleaned up cities and towns around the country, just because it was centralized.
To get a little abstract for a minute, you guys go into monopoly theory and antitrust law in this chapter. I believe I'm on the Borkian side of the debate, as you are. I'm more Bork than I am Lena Khan. Quick primer for anybody listening. Bork says pay attention to consumer welfare. Lena Khan says try to figure out the proportion of the market, but also you can dictate the market however you want. When I've been pushed back by people on that, they've brought up, I think, a decent question, which is if a company gets too big, even if it doesn't dominate the market, it can just buy up any small companies that come along. And so it ends up being suppressive to innovation. Can you see situations where it would be better to adopt a different position than that Borkian?
History supplies zero evidence that this is a problem. There's no doubt that firms buy up other firms, but there's no correlation between that and consumers being harmed. There's no correlation between that and wages falling, prices rising. In fact, a lot of small businesses start in the hope of being bought up by larger firms in the industry. So there's just you can tell, almost anything's possible. You can tell all sorts of stories, but economic history provides literally no evidence that the process that you described corresponds with harm to the economy or to consumers or workers.
Well, and economic growth is a wave of creative destruction. Sears and Roebuck, you've heard of that company. It once dominated the American market for standard products. And today it's gone. And so this idea that companies can just get big and control things, it's not the way it works in the market. What tends to happen is government intervenes, and often government ends up being the instrument for helping companies keep out competition. And my view, and maybe it's unfair, of Lena Khan was, her view was the only thing that ought to be big is government. And it's the last thing that should be big in my
I think that is a fair. I gave her a fair shot because I think that it's a good. Monopolies are bad. I think monopolies are bad. Competition is good. Monopolies suppress innovation and they drive up prices. So I'm against monopolies, and I would like the government to break up coercive monopolies. Within that capitalist framework, there's two divisions. Group A says, just worry about harm to the consumer. It's too difficult to figure out what the market is, so just look and see if a company is harming its consumers or not. That's the evidence.
That's right. That's my tip.
Yeah,
that's consumer side.
The flip side, which I'm willing to listen to, is no. You need to. This is a process oriented thing, not an outcome oriented thing, because there's lots of potentialities. So if a company dominates too much of the market, even if it's not damaging consumers right now, it might in the future. It needs to be broken up. I'm open to that argument, but Lena Khan, over the course of her tenure at the FTC, would gerrymander the definitions of the market she was using in a way that I do not think was good faith, where she would look at like grocery mergers and go, well, Walmart doesn't count as a grocery store. It absolutely counts as a grocery store. But,
or Amazon doesn't count.
Yeah, and it was inconvenient to her build it. Like, she just didn't want big corporations. She thought big corporations are bad. You should split them up. That's different than what, so I don't think she was a good faith actor. So I'm with you, Senator.
I think there's that's a problem, Andrew. I think there's a more fundamental problem with Lena Khan's view. In fact, so big companies are always a threat to become monopolies. And so we do want to police against monopolization. Fortunately, in the market, we have policemen on the beat all the time. They're called entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs are constantly on the lookout for opportunities to seize profits. And so if an entrepreneur anticipates that this company is going to grow too big, if an entrepreneur sees that that company is exploiting consumers, as long as entry isn't restricted, private entrepreneurs, this is what history tells us, seizes those opportunities. And we don't need bureaucrats or government officials outguessing these entrepreneurs. How does Lena Khan, who doesn't have any of her own money at stake, how does she know better what is the proper size of Amazon or some supermarket than do entrepreneurs, people who actually have experience and skin in the game? Lena Khan wrote a law review article. That's it. And she got appointed to the Federal Trade Commission. Other people have experience, they know the markets, and they're willing to put or not put their own money on the line making these bets. And as our book shows, history proves it again and again and again that this competitive process works to the for the betterment of consumers and workers and economic growth generally.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, if I could, that if there's conspiracy and restraint of trade, if the actions are reducing supply and increasing prices, then the consumer sovereignty standard calls for intervention. And we're for that. But too often government regulation ends up being perverted into protecting producers. And it's not as if we didn't live this history. We had 80 years of progressive era regulation. And what happened? We ended up with regulations that artificially increased the price of virtually everything they regulated, was artificially expensive and was inefficiently produced because of their regulation.
Well, let's move forward to the Great Depression. My schooling taught me that, and I'm a little bit more up to date on this now, but at the time, my schooling was capitalism is inherently wild and chaotic, and that profit-seeking motive leads to booms and busts because it's just this big conflagration. It needs to be restrained. And in the particular case of the Great Depression, the proximate cause of starting that boom bust cycle was that we had no regulations on margin calls, or very weak regulations on margin calls. So I could buy up stock on credit, and that created a giant bubble. And when the bubble popped, it ruined the market, and we were sent spiraling there until FDR, peace be upon him, was able to bring in the New Deal, and then ultimately World War II because Keynesianism. So what of that would you disagree with? I'll kick it to you first, Professor Boudreaux.
Well, as Senator Gramm would say, almost everything. If you look at, and these are not difficult facts to discern. The buying on margin was declining by the late 19th.
Yeah, and the margin requirement had been raised.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and the portion of income that went to ordinary workers and ordinary households in the 1920s, contrary to the popular claim, did not shrink. It isn't as if the rich got a larger share of that income. The rich got a smaller share than they had gotten earlier of that income. So consumer spending wasn't declining. What happened was there was the downturn that started in August of 1929. That was partly caused the stock market crash in October, and then the Fed, under the influence of a doctrine that's too complicated to get into now, the Fed allowed the money supply to shrink by more than 30%. The Fed fell down on the job. The Fed was created in 1913 to do precisely what it failed to do in the early 1930s, and that is act as a lender of last resort. And the Fed allowed the money supply to fall. If the Fed had not been created and we had the institutions that were in place before that, the banking system itself, although not perfect, would almost certainly have not allowed the money supply to fall as badly as it did. And then, of course, on top of this, in June of 1930, we get the Smoot-Hawley tariff, as well as other interventions by the decidedly not pro-laissez-faire Herbert Hoover, who did not just stand by and let things happen. He intervened in lots of other ways. And then, of course, FDR only put that intervention on steroids. And then if you look at the entire history of the 1930s, there were ups and downs, but unemployment never fell below double digits. It never got out of double digits. It stayed really high, and stayed really high because of the uncertainty created by the interventions that began under Hoover and that were accelerated under FDR.
Yeah, let me add something to that I think is important. What is important is that nobody in all of this history of the period of any significance as a historian ever went back and looked at the UN, at the League of Nations data on what happened in other countries. What happened in other countries is that we recovered more slowly than any other developed country in the world other than France. That most of the rest of the world had gotten out of the recession by 1935. But we had dug deeper into it because of increased government action that frightened investment and that scared off investors who could have pulled us out of the recession.
Today, the presumption would be that
no,
the presumption today would be that our European friends are spending more because they're more enlightened and they're more progressive, so they've got higher taxes and higher spending. This was not the case back during the Great Depression. We were the ones that were leading the charge on this, and we recovered more slowly than Britain or Germany.
we were the ones who were leading the charge on experimenting calamitously with new forms of government intervention. It wasn't so much government spending. It was these regulatory interventions, the attempts to prevent prices and wages from adjusting. It's no coincidence, as George Selgin shows in his new book, False Dawn, that France is the only other major country in the world that pretty much followed the same sorts of policies that FDR had in place in the 1930s. And France and the U.S. Were the two countries that lingered long in the Great Depression. And as Senator Gramm points out, we have all these. In fact, I didn't know about these data until I learned from my co-author. But the only person that I know of before us to make note of these UN data is the historian Bert Folsom. But they're very revealing, and it shows that the United States and France were outliers, and they were outliers because they were the most interventionist.
Can I ask a dumb economic question? You brought up earlier that in the during the robber baron era, we had a deflationary economy that's the opposite of now, where the economy was growing faster than the money. That sounds great. That means that every day my dollar's worth more than it was. So if the Fed cut the monetary supply by 30% back during the Great Depression, it sounds like everybody's money just became that much more valuable. So why was that a problem?
Well, the problem is it did. The money supply in 3 of the 4 first years of the Depression actually fell faster than prices. So that what we call in economics, I hate to get into the jargon, but what we call the real balance effect, where the economy stabilizes itself because as prices go down, the value of money goes up and people spend more. The money supply, because of the failure of the Fed, actually fell faster than prices. So even though prices were going down, people had less money, and the money supply had fallen faster than prices.
Okay.
It's one thing to have price. It's one thing to have the dollar's value increase because output increases and the money supply stays the same. It's quite another to have an active reduction in the supply of money. There are elaborate economic theories that explain the difference, but the causes of what happened in the late 19th century were very different from what happened 40 years later. In the late 19th century, it was an increase in productivity and output. In the 1930s, it was a decrease in the supply of money. And those two things are they're categorically different in their economic consequences.
Okay. Something you bring up that I appreciated in the book. So even with people that are big fans of the New Deal, which is everybody I grew up with, there's when you kind of talk to them for a minute, they'll go, well, the New Deal was very important. It was really good. It's not actually what fixed the Great Depression. What got us out of the Great Depression was World War II. There was a tremendous amount of spending, and that primed the pump, and all that capital came in to fix the economy. Something you pointed out in the book that I've never thought before is, if that were the case, wouldn't we just slide right back into depression when the war was over? Because the spigot was turned off pretty rapidly, and instead we had a gigantic industrial boom.
Yeah, no doubt. Look, I give Don credit for this, is that the Depression actually didn't end until 1952 in terms of the value of the stock market and the value of goods and services that went to the worker. So The war ended the unemployment problem, which happens when you put 12 million men in uniform. But it didn't end the Depression. The quality of life, the goods and services available to workers didn't recover until the 1950s. And a large part of that was the uncertainty that was created by the policies of the New Deal.
Yeah.
And you got to remember, this was an era when government in the Soviet Union and in Germany, in Italy, in Japan, there was all of this expansion of government in seizing private property, and it frightens people. And so, as a result, they sat on their money rather than invest it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no, Phil credits me. I credit the economic historian Bob Higgs, whose research was instrumental on this. He dates the actual depression a little bit earlier, in the late 1940s, but it's the same idea. And if you read the Keynesians of the era, I mean, prominent people, Paul Samuelson, the first American to win the Nobel Prize in economics, one of the most influential economists of all time, he was predicting as World War II was coming to an end. He said, "Look, we cannot given that wartime spending is going to fall, we have to run unprecedented budget deficits just to stay even." And he predicted calamity. And fortunately,
Most economists did.
Most economists did. He wasn't alone. Gunnar Myrdal was another, and lots of other prominent economists. And their advice, fortunately, for various reasons, was not followed. And there began, after World War II, perhaps the greatest economic boom ever in human history.
Yeah. That era was full of all sorts of really dumb regulations. Like I found out a few years ago, Canada had no major bank collapse during the Great Depression. And the reason for that,
it didn't have a central bank.
Yeah. And they also had the ability to own assets across state lines. So we had this weird system in the United States where we wanted to contain banks. Like if you're in Oklahoma, your bank can only operate in Oklahoma. Well, all Oklahoma has is wheat and oil. So if one of those two things goes under, the bank goes under because it can't diversify its options. If you're in Cleveland and you can only do things in your local area, you can't diversify. Whereas Canada didn't have that. So all the banks could buy assets in Manitoba and Alberta. And if the maple syrup industry declined, it's okay because we still have all those moose pelts or whatever, however the Canadian economy works. But as a result, like their banking sector didn't just implode the way we compelled ours to.
Yeah, it's one of the few true serious flaws in the American economy that we've always had until very recently. A highly fractionalized, localized banking system made so by regulation. It's a testament to the power of the American economy and other dimensions and American entrepreneurs that we were able to overcome that flaw.
But you can look at Canada, for example, and see what a better system did in terms of their rate of recovery and how deeply they went into the Depression.
Which is apparently not nearly as bad as us.
No, that's right.
Let's jump into modernity. I am alive for the Great Recession. I graduated college and the Great Recession hit. The standard narrative, I'll say this one's much more divided. I think everything else we've discussed up to this point, there is a broad consensus opinion against the two of you. Where if you just ask the average American or any of my instructors growing up, they would take the position that it was probably a lack of regulation and wild capitalism that caused the problems. When we get into the Great Recession, though, I think that this is something that's still kind of a point of debate. It's not a consensus opinion. One side of it says there were a bunch of Reaganites and Clintonians that were just dogmatically obsessed with deregulation because capitalism is their god, and they sent all the watchdogs home. And as a result, predatory lenders flooded the market, and also Phil Gramm specifically caused the Great Recession.
Alan Greenspan got most of the credit, which I deserved. But no, look, the first thing we do in rebutting the myth is to show, by looking at every banking bill passed for 30 years, that what had happened is regulatory powers increased. They didn't decrease. And Graham Leach Bliley, a bill that I was the author of, basically allowed banks to be in the insurance business and the security business, but each of those businesses were regulated by the same regulators that regulated them before, and nothing was deregulated. And you could only do those things at a bank in a well-capitalized holding company. The Great Recession, or subprime crisis, as I call it, occurred because government, starting in the first Clinton administration, pushed the banking regulators to reduce lending standards so that we could expand home ownership. And as a result, we filled the country up with mortgages that people ended up unwilling to pay back or unable to pay back. And the result was when housing prices stopped rising and people had to start paying those bills, we had defaults on a wholesale basis. And it pulled down the banking system of the world. There's no evidence that if we had had more regulators or if they had had more power, that they would have done any more than they did. They were conflicted by the fact that they had safety and soundness regulations and they had the power to enforce it, but they also had the new standards of trying to force feed subprime mortgages. Banks were encouraged to hold subprime mortgages. And as a result, the banking system filled up with them. That's what caused the Great Recession.
So I'm going to woefully push back because you actually wrote the bill in the Senate and I was just graduating college. But as I recall, so you wrote a bill that repealed Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall.
Well, actually, it didn't. But it doesn't matter.
Okay, so it wasn't just a reversal of it. You tweaked it or something?
No, look, my bill did nothing for mortgage-backed securities. They were already held by banks under Glass-Steagall. What my bill did is simply let it made legal what was already being done, and that is banks had gotten into these other businesses, and we just set up a system to regulate.
All right.
But in terms of a deregulation of those activities, there was no deregulation. No deregulation bill passed. And very much to his credit, Bill Clinton has never taken any position other than that Graham Leach Bliley, which he supported and signed into law, did not cause a financial crisis, and there's no evidence to suggest that it did.
All right. Correct me on this. My understanding is that what your bill did was previously there'd been a firewall between commercial banking and investment banking. The firewalls removed it. Now financial institutions are free to use deposited funds for speculation. So where I could see that going.
No, wait, say that again. They're free to do what?
Use deposited funds for speculation. So previously, I, the bank, am getting money for mortgages. I'm probably focusing on getting, regular qualitative or payments focused on like, is this person going to pay me back? I'm doing that for 30 years. Now, because the firewall's been lifted in terms of speculation and commercial banking and investment banking, I can do both. I could see banks shifting from how do we make sure that we're getting good mortgages to just getting lots of mortgages and going to quantity over quality.
But Senator, you didn't lift the firewall. I mean, it was a holding company that on one side you had commercial banks, and the other part you had investment banks, and it's still the case, wasn't it, that those funds were not mixed?
Yeah, and look, there's no evidence that loans made on securities had anything to do with the financial crisis. The financial crisis was triggered by a collapse in mortgage-backed securities. The bank I worked for, UBS at the time, had $50 billion of mortgage-backed securities on its balance sheet. Why? Because bank regulators rated mortgage-backed securities as secure as government bonds because they wanted banks to hold them, because they wanted the housing agencies to be able to make housing loans.
Okay. So if I'm following if I'm following your explanation of the Great Recession, in the book you mentioned that there's when the dot-com bubble ends, the Fed is afraid that there's going to be a recession, so it lowers interest rates, so it floods money into the housing market. It's real easy to get a mortgage now, so we've got a lot of free money. Housing market turbocharges as a result of this. Simultaneously, the Clinton administration, specifically Robert Reich, is pushing mortgage lenders to focus on giving out mortgages to poor people, affordable housing. Don't focus on whether or not they are actually able to pay for this mortgage, whether they've got the income necessary. Focus on getting people the mortgages. And then the final piece of this is the banking regulators that are a part of this administration have been told, we're trying to get everybody affordable housing. So tell everybody that these mortgage-backed securities of affordable housing, ignoring whether it's quality, whether it's effective or not, tell them it's as good as a bond. And so you've got this, you've got a heated up housing market. You've got bankers that are being incentivized to give mortgages out to people who can't afford them. And finally, you have regulators themselves who are obscuring whether or not these are safe.
Yeah, pushing banks to hold more mortgage-backed securities by treating them as equivalent to government bonds in terms of rating the quality of their capital. And you remember Countrywide was the first institution that said, we are the largest mortgage lender in the world. They were the first bank to go broke. What had happened is, as long as housing prices were going up and people could get second loans, the bubble didn't break. But when housing prices stopped going up, the bubble broke. And when it broke, there was wholesale default on these mortgages. And, people say, well, it was the fact that banks were in the securities business, but there's no evidence that security lending had anything to do with the financial crisis. People say, well, you got derivatives, but the derivative market held up very well during the financial crisis. What failed was housing policy. I'm sorry, it's like I'm suddenly in a bus station. And I was in a quiet place, and then all of a sudden it got noisy. I'm sorry. But if I seem nervous, it is not because of the financial crisis. It's because of all the throwing down of silverware on tables around here. I mean, go ahead.
One of the things, and we're beyond my pay grade on this. I do not know. I know very, very little about this, but fresh out of the recession, the thing that was typically brought up was, oh, they repealed Glass-Steagall. And what I've been told, I defer to you on this, is, okay, let's assume that is the case. Glass-Steagall would have relaxed certain regulations on what investment banks can do or something to that effect. But
see, that's where we differ.
Okay.
Glass-Steagall, we didn't repeal Glass-Steagall, still law. And under Glass-Steagall, banks could and did hold mortgage-backed securities, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so what we did was say that Glass-Steagall is still the law, but you can set up a financial services holding company if you meet very high capital standards. And that financial service holding company can run a bank, it can sell securities, it can sell insurance. And in fact, in the financial crisis, those financial services holding companies held up better than banks because they had three legs.
They had diversified, like we were talking about earlier.
Okay. Yeah. And so, but each of those areas continued to be regulated exactly as they were before. None of them were deregulated. That's the point. And that's the point that President Clinton has made consistently, that the bills simply rationalized the financial system and made it like every other major country in the world. And here's another argument. If banks being able to provide the three services through a holding company was the problem, why didn't the financial crisis start in Britain or France or Germany, where there had never been the separation of banking and securities and insurance? And the answer is because it didn't have anything to do with it. It was about mortgage-backed securities. And it was basically trying to make public money, private money serve a public purpose, which was to expand home ownership, which was a good thing, except when you force it into the marketplace and you force institutions to lower their lending standards, then you're planting the seeds for trouble down the road. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, I think what happens a lot in political economy is people go, rightly, it's important that people have homes. It's important that people are not afraid to be out on the street. Absolutely. Supply and demand shouldn't apply here. And I go, you don't get to exempt the universe from supply and demand because it's important. There aren't situations where you get to go, well, scarcity doesn't apply here because that's bad. I'm afraid that's the underlying reality that we have.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like gravity shouldn't
Yeah.
apply here because it'd be a lot easier to lift things. But the problem is it does apply.
Right.
It always will.
And when you override markets, you're looking for trouble.
Well, we'll finish up here in a minute. Your final chapter in the book is on poverty in the United States. I do think I'll push back on a little bit on this. So I've heard this position before that the war on poverty was counterproductive. It failed in its goals and such and so forth. You take the position that the war on poverty more or less promulgated government dependency and therefore idleness and unemployment. So the effect of it has been unemployment. But I look at like Sweden and Denmark and Germany. They have very robust social safety nets and they have higher employment rates than we do. So aren't those orthogonal? Can't we have social safety nets and have a high labor participation rate?
Well, look, I think theoretically we could, but I will have to say with my 25 years in government, one of my great frustrations was we never found a way to help people without lowering their incentive to help themselves. And all I know is in the American Anti-Poverty Program, from the time it went into effect until today, the percentage of people, able-bodied people working, fell from 68% to 36%. And so you now have a large number of people who are drawing government benefits, who are able-bodied, of prime work age, that aren't working. So we've eliminated much of want in the country and need, but we have done it at a price of idleness. And it has a terrible social cost, and it has an individual cost. How many people that are on welfare have real ability that has never been discovered? So I think we've hurt the very people we tried to help.
Yeah, I think your question is a good one, Andrew, and a theoretical book or a longer book devoted to the welfare state, the economics of the welfare state might answer that. Our goal in that chapter was simply to look at the facts of the American experience, and that's what happened. As Senator just said, the Great Society did indeed dramatically reduce the number of people in want, but for whatever reason, the way it was carried out in the U.S. is it also greatly diminished the incentive of a lot of people to participate in the American economy by being in the workforce.
How would you all? I realize this is a broad question, but how would you modify the social safety net? I do think there ought to be one more than just my preference would be that we have really good families. Like I've been unemployed before, and I'd rather have my family than unemployment. But if I don't have a family, I need to have something. So what would you do that would be a better way of making sure that people don't fall from the cracks, but also don't stay as welfare dependents, on a multi-generational basis?
Well, let me start on it by saying that we're now at the point where if you add up the real value of all the transfer payments that are received, you got to remember, in setting out the poverty level, the Census Bureau does not count 88% of the benefits that go to poor people. They don't count a check you get from the Treasury in a refundable tax credit. They don't count debit cards you get for Medicaid. They don't count housing subsidies, Medicaid. And so now we are providing for the bottom 20% of the population. When you count government transfer payments, the value of those payments plus what they earn is about $65,000 a year. Now, if you don't have any skills of any significance, you're as well off taking all that welfare as you are working. And so the amazing thing is that you got 36% of those people working. One of the things we show in the chapter on poverty is that the benefits to working, if you don't have any skills, are virtually non-existent.
The non-monetary benefits. I mean, the monetary.
The benefits are self-esteem and you're accumulating skills. So you've got to have a mandatory work requirement for able-bodied people under the current system if you're going to provide that level of support. And I think the data shows pretty convincingly that the second most important thing in getting out of poverty is, first, do you work? And secondly, do you have sharp tools? What degree do you have education? And I think the failure, especially in our inner city schools, is now a major impediment to dealing with poverty in America. And I'm not saying that school choice is the be all and end all, but all I know is it works. The quality goes up. And I want to do anything that makes the quality higher, because I believe there's extraordinary ability in ordinary people. And I think just generally it's never discovered. And I think it's a great tragedy for them and for us.
One of the parts you bring up in the book that blew my mind was how we define poverty statistically in the United States. So a year or two ago, Senator, you've been on the program talking about your book on inequality. It was very similar to that, where when we're looking at inequality rates in the United States, the Census Bureau going back to 1947 does not take into effect taxes that are coming from you or contributions in kind through government programs. So if I earn $300,000 a year and I pay $60,000 in taxes, and you earn $15,000 a year and you get $30,000 in benefits, neither of these are factored in. They literally do not play any role in terms of inequality. I did not know that we do something very similar with poverty, which, as you point out, with poverty in the United States, the poverty rate does not take into account anything the government gives you. I think there's 12% of what we factor in that's like direct cash transfer payments or something to that effect, but not food stamps, not housing. So if you're not one, you can't fix it then by definition. If we're gonna use the same statistics, literally give everybody $1 million, they would still be.
Yeah, this has been going on for 50 years. We increase welfare benefits. We don't count them as income. And then 10 years later, we say, well, we still got the same number of people who are poor. So we increase welfare benefits. We don't count them as income. I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal when President Biden came out and said, if we double the child tax credit, we will cut child poverty in half. I wrote an article saying, no, you won't. And the reason I knew we wouldn't is because we don't count refundable tax credits as income. And sure enough, when the poverty figure came out, poverty went up, not down. And the Census Bureau was forced by the administration to put out another poverty measure that they had never released at the same time before. It was an experimental one that counted more transfer payments, including the refundable tax credits. So, and why did this happen? Well, in 47, when it all started, it probably made sense. There weren't many payments where you
Yeah,
got
we
the
just hand you an
government
envelope
paying
of
for
cash, and we're like, that's taxable, by the way. That was fine. It
Yeah.
made sense then.
But
yeah.
Then, with a war on poverty, almost all welfare programs were payments in kind, food stamps. And since the census doesn't count taxes, they didn't count refundable tax credits as income. So the statistics of the United States are completely biased by the fact that they don't take into account taxes as income lost or government payments as income gained. And as a result, they say the ratio of the top 20% to the bottom 20% is over 16 to 1. If you count taxes and transfer payments, about 4 to 1. Now, you can say 4 to 1's too high, but it's a totally different
Yeah,
debate.
this is something I learned from you, Senator, that I point out fairly regularly when getting into conversations about inequality is by the definitions we currently use, it literally cannot be fixed. Like if what you're trying to fix is via taxes, if you're like, we should just tax rich people more. Okay, maybe we
Yeah.
should, but literally that would not change how we look at any of this. It would be exactly the same.
No, the measure won't be fixed.
That's right.
And the tragedy is there are still poor people, about 1.5% of the population, that have fallen through the cracks. And increasing food stamps doesn't affect them because they don't apply to food stamps. They've generally got physical or mental problems, or they've got drug problems, and they're not being reached by the program. And one other thing it's important to remind people, 50 years ago, poverty in America was an unmarried woman with a bunch of children, okay? That is 50 years old. Now poverty, the average poverty household is 1.9 people, and it's basically a guy who is drawing welfare benefits, taking dope, and watching television all day. That is a prototype of the non-working, able-bodied person that's getting welfare benefits. And it's a great tragedy.
One of the things that I was surprised to read in your book, and I'd like you to elaborate on this, because it surprised me, it would shock many of my friends, and we just flat out not believe it. You say when transfer payments are taken into account, only France redistributes a larger portion of its GDP than the United States within the industrialized world. So if I'm reading you correctly, we redistribute more of our GDP than Britain does, or on a proportional basis, more of our national economy goes to redistribution than Britain or Germany or Spain or Canada?
Yeah, Sweden.
Yeah.
Far more than Sweden. We have a more progressive tax system than Sweden has. Far more progressive. And while if you define poverty as on a percentage basis of per capita income, on the international comparisons, we're high. But if you define it in terms of purchasing power of the real income that is paid to poor people, we have a much lower poverty rate than Germany or France or European countries because of how much we pay out.
Or you also bring up that I think the standard international rate for poverty is 2/3 of the median of the country. Well, the American median's like twice as high as most of our European allies. So like
Yeah.
in Scotland, where I go all the time, I want to say that the median household income is like 30 or 40,000, whereas in the United States is 70 to 80,000, literally double.
No,
And
it's
so if we're doing
and
two-thirds
that's
of the Scots versus two-thirds of the Americans, you could be in American poverty and still earning more than
oh
somebody over there.
And be a relatively rich
yeah.
Scotsman.
Yeah.
Well, look, this is the only country in the world where 40% of people who are defined as poor own their own home, and 80% of them have air conditioning. Most of them have a flat screen color television, and it is because we're so affluent and because our programs are so good.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up. I'll give you guys the floor for a moment. Is there anything in the book that you'd like to talk about that we didn't cover? Professor Boudreaux, any parting thoughts?
No, thank you for having us, Andrew. The one part of the book that we didn't cover, of course, is our long chapter on trade, which is especially prominent now as we're recording this in May of 2025. I think the senator mentioned earlier, it's just a myth to believe that the American economy has been hollowed out by trade, and I just want to put that out there. We have a whole long chapter with lots of data and argument busting to smithereens that fallacy.
Yep.
Yeah, all I would say is we want you to read the book. We think the more you know about our country and about how our system works, the greater you'll see the country is. The Bible says you shall know the truth and truth will make you free. But the problem is getting to the truth. Well, we're trying to get to it here. Whether we succeeded or not is another issue.
Well, I'll add it's very readable. It's not terribly. It's about an inch thick. And so there are books that are like dense, jargon-filled economic tomes that you read if you are going to get a degree in economics. This is not one of them. This is written by economists for laymen, in my experience. I didn't struggle to read any of it. And while it has a lot of empirical data in it, it doesn't get bogged down or boring. You're very clear, you're very direct. For people that want to learn better economic history, or if you disagreed with this interview, learn alternate economic history, it's very good for you. I'll add, if you got a son, daughter, niece, nephew about to go to college, I'd give him this just to make him more irritating. I think this would be a really good way to irritate a lot of people in academia.
Well, may I say one more thing? I'm at the University Club in Washington, and I was told that I could use this room. And about 2/3 into our discussion, all of a sudden, all these people came in, started dumping silverware on the table. So, especially in the period where we were talking about Graham Leach Bliley. So if I looked distressed, it was because of all the noise going on around here. I'm very comfortable and relaxed in talking about the law since I know a little bit about it. But anyway, I apologize for that. But despite all the background noise, there are a lot of things in this book that the average reader would benefit from. And why it's so important right now, Andrew, is what we say is the 7 great myths are now conventional wisdom in the country. And John Stuart Mill said, if you don't know both sides of an argument, you don't know very much. Well, here we're giving the other side of the argument. And I think if you look at it and weigh the facts, you'll see that it's the better side.
Yeah, I think FDR prolonged the Depression. And when I tell people that, they think I'm a crackpot. They act like it's like I think we probably faked the moon landing, and I think we did it in France. Like, I just sound like I'm nuts. And they're like, it is known, Khaleesi. It is known, Khaleesi, that FDR saved the country for that. I'm like, look,
no, my mother and grandmother went to their graves believing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you both. Phil Gramm and Don Boudreaux, thank you so much. The book that we've been discussing is The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism. You can get it on Amazon. I suspect you can get it from various university presses. You can definitely get it by going to mightyheaton.com/featured, where you can find that and all books we discuss. Thank you. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Dr. Don Boudreaux and Senator Phil Gramm, for coming on to talk about economic myths. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's program. And thank you, listeners, who make the whole thing possible. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.